So part of the network's activities then is this series of seminars, which is now in its third series. We're starting the third series today, running from March to June of 2022. And I'll explain a little bit more later on after today's event about the upcoming seminars. Just to say at the outset, the seminars are open to everyone. The network, of course, is open to researchers in the field, but the seminars are open to anyone working in the field of human rights education. And they're recorded and uploaded on YouTube on our special channel. So if you've missed any of the previous excellent seminars in the series, please do follow us on the WERA YouTube channel. And I'm authorized also to share the good news today that the seminar series has been so successful that WERA has actually pledged to continue supporting the seminar series for the next few years. So we're delighted to announce that today. The network is also then connected to the Human Rights Education Review, which again, many of you are very familiar with, an open access peer-reviewed journal. And many of the papers that feature in the seminar series are actually already published on our website. And I know Piers, who is our technical coordinator today, will be providing details of the websites where you can access these papers. I also finally want to mention that WERA has established a special network for early career researchers. And that's for anyone engaged in PhD studies in the field or in their first 5 years of their career. And if you're interested in joining that network, please also look at the Human Rights Education Review announcements page. So I want to move, of course, then to today's event. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speakers today, as well as the wonderfully diverse audience, which has amassed to listen to their research paper. We've researchers and students and people working in the field from human rights education from all over the world, tuning in from Africa, the Middle East, Europe, the United States, and Europe. Hopefully we're going to hear perspectives from around the world then on the themes which are going to be discussed today. I'm grateful to our technical coordinator, Piers van Berg, who has asked me just to draw a few things to your attention by way of housekeeping to mention. Firstly, this seminar, like all our seminar series, is being recorded. Can everyone ensure again that their microphones are muted? And then there's a chat function, obviously open, and that's open for you, please, to contribute your questions during the talk, if you like. And I will then put those questions to the speakers, and you'll be able to contribute comments then, of course, in the discussion. So our paper today has been authored by Professor Audrey Osler, who I've mentioned before, but who needs absolutely no introduction to most of you as a pioneer and prolific author in the field of human rights education. Audrey has co-authored her paper with Jean-Arne Scara, and they're both going to introduce themselves. They have published their paper, The Rhetoric and Reality of Human Rights Education, Policy Frameworks and Teacher Perspectives. It's published already in the Multicultural Education Review, and I understand that the paper forms part of a wider research project which addresses human rights and diversity in Norwegian schools, and essentially looking today at the gap between policy frameworks and actual practice on the ground. And that's a phenomenon, of course, that many of us can identify with in regard to human rights education wherever it's happening in the world. So this paper considers what the missing pieces of the puzzle might be. And so I'm going to hand over to Audrey now, who's going to introduce herself, as I say, and Jean-Arne in more detail and explain how their paper is going to be presented. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you, Suzanne. Hello, everyone. And it's a real delight to be presenting in this WERA webinar series after hosting it for so many previous sessions. The title of our talk this evening is The Rhetoric and Realities of Human Rights Education, Policy Frameworks and Teacher Perspectives. My work is at the University of Southeastern Norway, and my co-presenter, Jean-Arne, who is a graduate of the same university, and he will briefly introduce himself, but will not be doing the presentation with me because he has very little voice this evening, and he's going to save that if you have questions that you would like to put to us at the end. He's saving his voice for that. So I'm a professor there. I'm very delighted to see that so many students from our university are here this evening, as well as more experienced researchers. Jan-Arne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, hello, I'm Jan-Arne Skara. I'm, like Audrey said, I'm a graduate from the University of Southeastern Norway, where I did the human rights and multiculturalism study. And after that, I did teacher training. So I'm now a certified teacher in social sciences, history, and human rights, of course. And I'm also the researcher for this article. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm having problems moving my screen forward. Yes, could you? Okay, so we're going to begin by outlining the policy framework of human rights education in the Nordic region, so Norway and its neighboring countries. And you'll see here where Norway is situated in the world if you live in another part of the world. And all of the Nordic countries have long adopted the rhetoric of human rights education. So all countries are of human rights as well. So you'll find that in human rights education policy across the region, you will hear human rights mentioned and human rights validated. And these nations as well have also recently built in notions around intercultural competencies and recognition of diversity into education policy and practice. That's come a little bit later, but these two things are working side by side. And in Norway, and I know there are many Norwegians listening this evening, human rights do form a key feature of national identity. So in Norway, people are pleased generally to associate themselves with human rights and say, yes, we are a human rights country and we're proud to be so. Educators will tell you that education policy is underpinned by human rights. And I'm not sure if this is unique in the world, but since 2014, when Norway modernized its constitution and made the constitution available in modern Norwegian language rather than the archaic language of 200 years ago, human rights education became a constitutional right. So if you are a student in Norwegian schools, therefore, it is your constitutional right to learn about human rights and to study human rights. That's the theory that we're working on. And yet, in the 21st century, we know that human rights commitments are frequently questioned, not just in Europe, but globally. And we know also that in the region, we've seen right-wing governments restricting human rights entitlements relating to citizenship and belonging. So, there's been a discussion, for example, in Denmark, who is a real Dane? And although nobody has said there's a real division between those who are real and not real Danes in terms of their rights, there has been a discussion that those who can claim their heritage in Denmark, those who can say they have two Danish-born parents, are in some way regarded as more Danish. And in Norway, as in many other countries, sadly, in Europe, including the UK, where I'm based this evening, we have seen withdrawal of citizenship from certain citizens in Norway, particularly when they're accused of having told untruths when they first arrived in Norway as refugees. So this is the process that we have seen taking hold in a number of countries. So tonight, our key question and the key question of our paper is the human rights rhetoric of education policy sufficient to fulfill the aims of a transformational human rights education that would be appropriate for the multicultural society and that we're living in and the globalized world that we're living? Does it empower learners to know their rights and defend their rights and those of others? This is the question that prompted us to really look closely at the curriculum. And I just wanted to briefly state what I understand and what we present in our paper as human rights education. For most of you, you'll be very well aware that we can find in the UN Charter from 1945 an emphasis on respect for human rights. This is the basis of our human rights framework that we hold internationally. And also that we find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the purpose of education should be directed to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups. It shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. So that's the formal commitment of the international community. So what does that, that's the basic, that's the minimal starting point for human rights education. In our paper, Janana and I are talking about transformative human rights education. And I know that you'll find in the literature many different definitions of this. So what we're arguing is that transformative human rights education involves a critical examination of the present. It involves an examination of the society we're living in. And it involves a critical examination or reflection of the past. And we argue that it requires teachers to engage in a process of self-reflection, that teachers have to think about their own context and their own professionalism and their own relationship to human rights, and that it requires teachers to support learners in reimagining a just future, that it's not just about teaching knowledge, but it's reimagining what would a world based on human rights look like. And we also argue, very, very importantly, that transformative human rights requires teachers to support students in enabling change. It requires teachers to equip students with skills, knowledge, and indeed the confidence to believe that they can bring about change. So it's not about a passive acceptance of the status quo. It's about not just imagining a just future, working towards a just future. Now, I turn to the core curriculum, what translates as the core curriculum in the Norwegian context. The core curriculum in Norway is something which is a document anyone can read. It's been around for many years now, but it's not a document that teachers will necessarily refer to when they start teaching. It's not a document that is necessarily an everyday document, but in that document, it stresses that the basis of the Norwegian curriculum is Christian and humanist values. And you find that phrase over and over again, Christian and humanist values all the way through. It's almost a mantra. It's run through the core curriculum very, very strongly. And there's a little bit of a concern there, because what if you're not a Christian? What does that actually mean for you? There's a real danger of equating Christian with humanist and believing that human rights belong to our culture, Norwegian culture, which people have described as a secular Lutheran culture. And there are then other people who are excluded from that. So there's a real risk that this puts the notion of human rights in a multicultural society at risk. If human rights belong to us, then they don't belong to them, whoever the them happens to be. And the second thing I think we need to think about is that the process of building a culture of human rights is something which requires students to be able to examine their own experiences. It requires them to be able to examine the justices and the injustices in their own lives. However, other researchers in Norway, notably Vesterdal, who looked at the upper secondary school, found that teachers didn't like talking about human rights in Norway. They like talking about human rights violations in other parts of the world. And when Vesterdal asked the teachers, why is this? Why are you teaching about distant places and not about our own society? They said, well, human rights violations in Norway are peanuts. They're nothing. They're not important compared with these gross violations of human rights elsewhere. So what would that mean then for teachers? This is what we were trying to understand. And what would that mean for students? So to answer our question, we draw on analysis of the published curriculum, and we also look at data from teachers. And this is the work that Jon Arne has done in great detail. He's gone and he's talked to a group of teachers to, one by one, try and understand how they understand human rights and human rights education. But before we turn to the teachers, I'd just like to reflect, what does the curriculum say about human rights for students up until year 10? So we looked at two subject areas. One was social studies, and one is a subject known in Norway as Christianity, religion, life views, and ethics. And in social studies, there's not an awful lot of guidance there, but it says, give an account of the main principles of the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the most essential UN conventions, such as the ILO Convention concerning the rights of indigenous people. Explain how these are laid out in legislation, and discuss and elaborate on the consequences of violating human rights. So that's what students are supposed to be able to do by the end of year 10. And in Christianity, religion, life views, and ethics, students are supposed to be able to, at the end of their study, to discuss and elaborate on ethical questions relating to human worth, human rights and equality, in among other ways, by basing themselves on real life role models. Now, though that's the guidance that teachers get. If I was a teacher, I would say that was extremely open-ended, and that maybe I could more or less do what I liked. The context of that is, in Norway, teachers have a huge amount of autonomy compared with many other countries. They have to work within the written curriculum, but they have a lot of freedom in how they might interpret that curriculum. So their perspectives are clearly very, very important, perhaps more important than in many other jurisdictions, in understanding how human rights are operationalized. Now, there's a real risk to this, because teachers can interpret teacher autonomy as carrying a lot of responsibility and a duty to their students. But teachers can also say, well, it means I make the choices. I'll decide what I will focus on. I'll focus on the rights that I consider important, rather than think about students' entitlements. So there is a bit of a risk there, and I want to highlight that dilemma. So also want to add that since we first started working on this study, that the curriculum has been revised. It was revised in 2020, and that's coming online right now. And the curriculum remains competence-based. And I think this poses real questions for us about whether there's a basic human rights knowledge base. And if there is a basic human rights knowledge base, where are we going to find it? Are we going to find it in sociology? Are we going to find it in ethics? Is there certain elements of human rights law that teachers should have access to? Is it just human rights history? What is that knowledge base? And I need to emphasize that in this revised curriculum, a lot is going to hang on these two issues. One, teacher accountability, and secondly, teacher education. So we're not in the business of criticizing teachers. I'm involved in an institution which engages in teacher education. So we're also very, very aware that what teachers learn is our responsibility. Now, the teachers in our study, it was a small study of, it was a big study of the curriculum, but it was a very modest study of teachers. Jan Arno collected data from 5 teachers in 3 different schools. 2 of the schools were regular Norwegian lower secondary schools, and 1 interviewee taught at a Waldorf school based on the principles of Rudolf Steiner, but fully funded by the Norwegian state. So what you've got to understand in Norway is when a school is independent of the state, it's still funded by the state and it still has obligations to the students to fulfill certain basic requirements of the state. So these were in-depth, one-to-one interviews. Jan Arno spent time talking to each of these teachers in depth. Remember, he wasn't a teacher at the time, so he shouldn't have been too much of a threat to them. He wasn't testing them. He wasn't acting as an inspector. But 3 of the teachers had more than 5 years experience and 1 had less than 5 years. And he found 4 women and 1 man. Now, I've not looked at that alongside the numbers of male and female teachers, but like in a lot of places, our teaching force remains predominantly female. My screen has frozen. Seems to be a little... Right, so let's look then at the teacher perspectives on human rights education in Norway. You'll have to read our full paper to really get into the teacher perspectives. What I've tried to do here is to summarize some of these. And first one, why are teachers teaching about human rights? What is it? And this is a quote from one of them. And we find overall that teachers' own interest in teaching about human rights is the most important issue to them. When they decide to teach about human rights, it's what they personally are interested in. And our first teacher, Anne, says as follows: I believe it's very teacher dependent, and I do not believe that all students get the same quality in their human rights education, and there are probably some who have next to nothing, even though it's in the core curriculum and learning goals. And I would add, even though it's their constitutional right. So that's a theme that ran through our interviewees, summed up by Anne, that it's very much teacher dependent what happens. And the next interviewee talked to us about language and the difficulties of language. Now, in Norway, and Jan Arno and I have discussed this at length, the subjects of race and racism remain very sensitive. Now, you might respond to me and say that's the case all around the world. But I have been told that we shouldn't even, for example, this is an example of how sensitive, it's not polite to talk about racism. So that gives you a clue. When you're a foreigner in a country and you hear that something is not polite, you normally stop talking, and clearly that's the intention. But this is what one of them says: we've had some challenges with different ways of expressing ourselves due to diversity. The language can be quite tough and sometimes enter into what we would call discrimination and racism. So this teacher seems to be implying that students are not sure what language they should use, or what they're allowed to say or what they're not allowed to say, or what goes on in the classroom in terms of discrimination and racism. Now, this was the only teacher really who was actually able to name discrimination and racism, and the other teachers seemed to hedge around this. They were very uncomfortable even using these words. So what happens then, for example, if a student uses a racist epithet? Well, I would suggest that if a teacher doesn't feel comfortable already, it's going to be very, very difficult to know how he or she might respond when students move into an area of discrimination, and it might place certain students in minoritized students in a very vulnerable situation. And this is another issue that we found in our study, addressing freedom of expression and hate speech in the classroom. We quickly picked out that teachers were very keen on talking about freedom of expression. I think Jonana refers to it as the fashionable issue amongst teachers. It was fashionable for them to want to deal with freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is often the most common right that comes forward when you talk to people in Norway about human rights. And how do we then address freedom of expression and hate speech in the classroom? And Nina says, I do not find it to be a dilemma, but a good opportunity to discuss right and wrong, what they can say, how they should say it, and what is actually a violation of the law. So this is the first mention we've had of the law here. And Nina is very, very clear that she will say, no, we mustn't go beyond this point. And this is not acceptable language or whatever. And she hedges her bets a little bit more. She says, well, I think it could be a dilemma when one faces individual students with very special opinions. So we were very curious about this. Anne is talking about special opinions, but actually when you see the wider context of the transcript that between Jonana and Anne, you will see she's talking about extremism here. She's talking about very far-right opinions, for example, and she is not comfortable about naming them. She calls them special opinions. So that in itself is interesting. Maybe she was trying to prove to Jonana that she was very open, but how, we don't know exactly then whether she's able to guide students who express these extreme opinions or how she deals with them. I know that a couple of teachers in this study talked about allowing students to choose to write their essays on extreme opinions in the hope that that would free them from these extreme opinions. But if you have questions about that, Jonana will sure able to respond. So summarize then, what we find is that in the lower secondary school, human rights education is infrequently implicit. It's not explicit all the time, it's implicit, and it arises sometimes out of what students say. It's not necessarily as well planned as one might hope for. So if we think about that constitutional right, it's obviously not going to be the same constitutional right for everyone. Teachers focus on moral values. Teachers focus on moral values, which seems to be how they deal with the religious education aspect of human rights. We found they don't have an adequate legal knowledge base on human rights. When Jonana asked them questions, they quickly said, you know, don't test me on this. I'm not going to be able to quote the curriculum even, let alone know what laws apply. So that was interesting. They rarely address everyday injustices that are relevant to students' immediate experiences. They prefer to look at gross violations of human rights a long way away, just as Vesterdal found in his study for older students. And we think that's a big risk. We think that that might lead young Norwegians to be somewhat complacent about human rights injustices at home. Maybe not complacent, maybe just unaware that things are going on at home may not be actually just. And another concern we have is that the education policy and popular discourse maintains a distinction between those who embody national values, and they're referred to as ethnic Norwegians. That's the phrase that's used in Norwegian, but ethnic Norwegian is actually a euphemism for white. So there are those who embody national values, and others who need to learn these same values. And if you ask who needs to learn these values, it's very clear that this is newcomers to Norway. And which newcomers to Norway? This is often people of colour. So we find that discussion of racism, discrimination and injustice are largely taboo. They're not really dealt with directly in the curriculum and to any great extent. And they're something with which the teachers in our small study were reluctant to enter into on the whole, most of them, and therefore they're likely to go unrecognized. So the question then is, can research actually help close the gap between rhetoric and reality? Are Jon Arne and I just wasting our time doing a study like this? Or is there actually any benefit in looking at these things in more detail? Well, we would say yes and no. There are tensions in the policy framework between the overarching core curriculum and the subject competencies. There are definitely tensions. One tells you about a Christian and humanist values, and then we have just some limited guidelines on the subject competencies, and they haven't actually grown any more detailed in the new curriculum. Some teachers are arguing they're actually vaguer in the 2020 curriculum. Now, we're arguing that transformative human rights is about action for change. And we find that this is missing at all levels in education. Or as a colleague said to me recently, education for social justice, that's something we don't feel that confident about talking about in Norway. We think education perhaps has more instrumentalist values, or it's about reinforcing our national values. But education for change, that's education for social justice. It depends how you see yourself. Jon Arne reminded me that Norway is rated top in the happiness tables. So if you're very happy, if you're very confident that your society is the good one and the good life, then maybe it's less easy to see why you need action for change. And then we believe that human rights education is currently minimalist. It's there, but it's dependent on individual teachers and on their individual understanding. So what can we do? What does need to happen? And we've spent hours talking about this over the years, I think. But to sum up, thinking about this in terms of our paper, we suggest that human rights and diversity need to be addressed in tandem. You can't just have policy and you can't just have practice. One needs to support the other. And I think our paper comes to the conclusion that policy actually needs to go further. It needs to be more explicit and needs to guide teachers more closely. And then if it needs to happen in practice, we can't blame the teachers. We need to look also at teacher education. Public discourse and public policies and educational practices, if they all persist with an us and them, we're going to get ourselves in a tangle. This has got to be sorted out. We've got to stop thinking about two different groups, us, the ethnic Norwegians, and them, the newcomers. And we have colleagues of colour who aren't labelled ethnic Norwegians, even though they've been living in Norway all their lives. They are they know all these Norwegian values. They know all the traditions of Norway, but they're still not referred to as ethnic Norwegians. Now, we need to talk about race and racism then. And we do see some signs of movement in higher education, and in Norway, like elsewhere, there's a lot of talk about decolonizing the curriculum. But I would argue, and I think Jon Arne is going to support this, but that actually education research lags behind other fields a little bit here. And you can't address a problem if you don't acknowledge it. That's the key thing. If you're not able to talk about a problem, to acknowledge it's a problem, you can't do anything about it. So in Norway, we're very committed to gender equality. The Me Too movement has been embraced enthusiastically. There's a recognize that more needs to be done. But if you can't talk about racism, if you can't talk about injustice between people of different backgrounds and religions and so on, it's very, very hard then to tackle it. Human rights education, we believe, needs to give greater emphasis to skills that prepare youth to challenge injustice. We would argue that you do need a curriculum for social justice, and that this needs to be part of our discourse, and not just part of our discourse, but needs to be underpin our teacher education and our schooling. Norwegian students are given a lot of encouragement, and I know we have a number of Norwegian students here from my university, so I hope they'll reflect on this or feed back to us in a moment. There's a lot of emphasis on making Norwegians good internationalists, but is there a sufficient emphasis on improving life at home for everyone? We need to look afresh at teacher education. In the Nordic countries, there's a lot of money invested in teacher education. They're 5-year programs. There is every opportunity in a 5-year program to have a solid human rights education basis. And the final thing, we would argue that we need to look at who becomes a teacher in Norway, because our teaching workforce is predominantly white, it's predominantly female, and it doesn't reflect the people who make up Norway today. And if you want to see more about the experiences of a teacher from a minoritized background, I invite you to look at a paper I wrote with my colleague Tony Berner on the experiences of a Turkish Norwegian teacher. And Tony and I believe that this is probably the first paper to look at a minoritized teacher's experiences in depth. So that's where I'd like to conclude, and I realize that many of you may have questions, and I hope that Jan-Arne will help me in addressing your questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Audrey. That was a fascinating paper, and it's certainly given us all food for thought, because many of the questions that you raise, of course, are ones that prevail in so many different countries and different political and cultural contexts. So I'm sure it's prompted many of us to, reflect on the extent to which similar phenomena play themselves out in human rights education, wherever we may be. What might be the variables and how might they be addressed? I'm not sure if Jan-Arne wants to come in just yet. There have been a few questions that have been put into the chat, but they've actually already happily been answered by some of your colleagues. I think in Southeastern University of Southeast Norway, our managing editor, Marta, has very kindly stepped in and answered a couple of questions about the curriculum there and the age group that is involved in terms of the study. We do have a question from Kuza Souza, who is looking to ask a question, bring you back to the issue of the clash between the right to freedom of expression and how that might clash with the right to protect others. I'll ask Kuza perhaps to put her question directly to you. If you could just introduce yourself, Kuza, tell us where you're from and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, I am very happy to be here and to listen this excellent presentation. Because I have read the paper and enjoyed very much. I am sociologist from Bratislava Academy of Science, and my research also was related with observation in school and relation in and the issue of inclusion, not only in education but also in child community. And so my question relates to how teachers deal with the right to protect the dignity of children and to be sensitive to their self-esteem and with the right of freedom of expression. Because according to my observation, teacher really put, as also your research has shown, put the freedom of expression on the top place and top value, and they seem to don't know how to deal with offensive content of expression and stop it, because the freedom of expression is really the sacred value. So sorry for to be long. Thank you very much.
Jan-Arne, would you like to answer?
I don't think we touched upon that in the article, did we?
We didn't really touch on this in depth in our article, that you're right. But as a classroom teacher, as somebody who's recently done their training as a teacher, is the emphasis more on freedom of expression, or do you feel you've been trained to deal with students' dignity and protect the rights of a child to feel to feel safe and comfortable in who they are?
To be honest, I actually think I learned more from the master's program than actually from the teacher training in this regard. I also learned a lot from this study, because I remember I had 3 very different opinions on how to deal with this. You had one teacher who was very open to letting individual students speak their mind, even if they were extreme, but she was also very careful to do so, because she was afraid that they might face a storm from the rest of the class. And then you have 2 opposites from 2 different schools, but those schools were quite close to each other, but they had quite different ways of doing things. One of them, whenever a discussion came up with, they had trouble with racism and gender equality and people being gay. That was, in one case, it was not accepted in one of the classes from certain students. So she just had to clamp it down, and that was her tactic, because it always ran out of hand. So no freedom of speech there. She just had to, every time the subject came up, she had to stop it. But in the other school, she managed to keep it under control, and they usually had what she would call a productive debate about both racism and discrimination, and also gay people and gender equality. That's the same teacher that actually managed to describe that they had problems with harsh language and racism. She also managed to get some meaningful discussions out of it. Mm-hmm. But I think it was, they have a different demography in those 2 schools, so that might have something to do with it.
Thank you.
So, different teacher, different method, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Jan-Arne. Yeah, and yet a common thread, a lack of training. For example, I thought it was interesting, the teacher who said that she would be able to decide what was against the law in terms of freedom of expression as well, when one of the findings in your paper is the lack of actual training even in many of these issues. We have another question from Martin Barrett, who wants to ask a question about intercultural competence. Martin, would you like to introduce yourself and also to ask your question? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne. Sorry, I haven't got my camera plugged in at the moment, so I'll just unmute myself. Audrey, many thanks indeed. Very interesting presentation, very interesting work that you've been doing. I was intrigued by the fact that on an early slide, you made a reference to the fact that Norway has begun to introduce intercultural competence into the curriculum. Now, as you know from my work, I sort of conceptualize the whole area of intercultural education, education for democratic citizenship and human rights education as one integrated whole. So it occurs to me, can that intercultural strand that is being introduced into the Norwegian curriculum, can that be harnessed in some sort of way to help address these issues of diversity? You know, you've got the first point on your ways forward slide. We suggest human rights and diversity need to be addressed in tandem. I would absolutely agree with that. And I would see that the intercultural competence strand, if you like, can be harnessed to do this if there's some sort of meaningful integration between, if you like, intercultural education and human rights education that's going on within the school. I mean, I'd just be really interested to hear your thoughts on these sorts of issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I think I know that many of my colleagues have looked to the work that you and others have done for the Council of Europe on intercultural competences, and this is something that colleagues talk about within teacher education. My own experience, even as part of this project with Jonana and others, is that I went into a number of schools to talk to head teachers about giving us access to their teachers to find out what their opinions were. And we wanted to do a very big survey, and did do a reasonable sized survey of teachers' perspectives, broader than the paper that Jonana and I have referred to, and that's, I can give you details of that separately. But what we did find was actually quite shocking to me. I realized through doing this project that in Norway, that not only do teachers have a lot of autonomy, but that teachers really are led in very, very different ways by the head teachers that they work under. And that that in a lower secondary school, a head teacher may choose to focus on human rights education if they wish. Another teacher may say, well, another head teacher may say, actually, I'm really interested in physical education and I really want to develop that. Another may say, I'm really interested in mathematics education and I hope all our students will excel in this. There's a huge amount of freedom. And we went into a school where we were told that the head teacher was really interested in human rights education. And he said, yes, I really welcome you into my school. And yes, your researchers can come in here and collect data. And it was a very diverse school. As you walked through the playground, you could hear many, many different languages spoken. And so our researchers went in, and with the head teacher's permission, met with the teachers at lunchtime and said, we have a survey that we'd like you to do, and we will hand it out to you and collect it in, and we make it as painless as possible, not take up too much of your time. And the teachers complained to the head teacher. They told him this survey, it was about intercultural education and human rights. And they said, this survey is not for us. It's for a school that is more multicultural than we are. And we really did not understand that response, because it was already a very diverse school, that a number of the students came from a local refugee center and were fed coming through that school. And so that head teacher backed down and said, okay, sorry, you can't come into my school and study this because my teachers won't cooperate with you. So there's a lot of it's very, very easy to say that that the formal curriculum has introduced intercultural competence as a value and a set of values and importance, but how it plays out is equally vulnerable, in my opinion, to human rights education. And whether people see the links, I don't think there's anything in the policy framework that really encourages those links to be made in any depth. That's my personal assessment of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Audrey. That's really interesting. It fits with some of our experiences at the Council of Europe in addressing Norwegian representatives through the education channels and the resistances that we've encountered there. So thank you. That's a very interesting perspective on that issue.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm conscious that unfortunately we've already reached the 5:30 mark, and at the same time there are some very interesting comments and further questions coming in concerning issues that have just been discussed. I'm afraid, I suppose, Audrey, we don't have the capacity to keep the conversation going, because I know that you're conscious to respect everybody's time. But may I suggest that if people would like to follow up perhaps with Audrey and Jan Arne on some of the issues, because they have raised a range of points and questions that really would lend themselves to further discussion in some other format, and perhaps to give your feedback on the paper. I know that Piers has very kindly put a link to the paper in the chat. People can look at that. And he's also given a link to the YouTube channel with previous presentations. And I noticed, Audrey, myself, if I may say, yourself and Jan Arne reference Walter Parker's presentation, which again is a very interesting thing, because it seemed to me, even as I listened to you, that many of the sort of elements which Parker would suggest are necessary are indeed lacking in the Norwegian framework, both the specialized knowledge and the access to everyday knowledge, or the opening up of everyday knowledge of the students. So just before we leave, I wanted just to mention, and I did promise that I would make reference to the other seminars that will be coming up in due course. And you can already register for these seminars on the Human Rights Education Review website. And I'd just like to just mention as well that two of the speakers I notice are with us today in the audience, and they are Francesca Zanata from the School of Education and Communities in the University of East London, United Kingdom, and she will be speaking on the 16th of April to her paper on examining relationships and sex education through a child's right lens, an intersectional approach. And then on the 27th of April, we have Eva Leinhardt from University College Copenhagen, Denmark, who is also going to talk about human rights education as a framework for transmitting religion as cultural heritage. Eva's paper has already been published in the Human Rights Education Review. And again, this is an opportunity, I suppose, to connect with some of the issues which Audrey and Jan Arne have raised in their paper, because there's some complementarity between the two papers in terms of the central theme there. So it just remains for me to thank our speakers again today for a really interesting and really engaging paper, and to wish Jan Arne well and hope that he gets well soon in particular. And to thank everybody for coming here today to engage with the paper and indeed with the network. We're delighted to see you here, and we look forward to your contributions in our next seminar. Eva, you have your hand up. Did you want to say something quickly?
Actually, I was just clapping for the
clapping. Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah. I'll take that as a good cue to end. And thank you once again to everybody. Take care.